If you can choose anyone in the room, why would you choose the one man who has nothing? The question floated through the grand ballroom just seconds before every conversation died. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble, champagne glasses shimmered in carefully gloved hands, and the wealthiest families in Boston waited for Charlotte Whitmore to smile politely and select one of the three men her father had already approved. Richard Whitmore stood at the center of the stage with the confidence of someone who had spent 40 years believing every problem could be solved with enough money and enough influence. At 66, the billionaire had built an empire that stretched from luxury hotels to commercial real estate, and tonight was supposed to be another carefully choreographed victory. His only daughter would choose her future husband in front of investors, politicians, and old family friends, reassuring everyone that the Whitmore legacy would remain exactly where it belonged. 3 velvet boxes rested on a polished table beside him, each containing a family ring that symbolized an alliance already negotiated behind closed doors. Charlotte looked at the rings without seeing them. She heard the applause around her, but felt strangely detached, as though she were watching someone else's life unfold from the back of the room. Her elegant navy evening gown, tailored perfectly for the occasion, suddenly felt heavier than armor. Then her eyes drifted away from the stage and settled near the entrance where guests rarely bothered to look. A little girl with dark curls knelt on the marble floor, struggling to tie the loose lace of her small sneaker. Beside her, a tall black man wearing a clean but worn charcoal jacket crouched quietly, his large hands moving with patient care as he finished tying the knot before brushing a strand of hair away from the little girl's face. He never glanced toward the stage. He seemed completely unaware that the richest people in the city were only a few yards away. His attention belonged entirely to the child smiling back at him. Ethan Brooks had only come to deliver a handcrafted wooden display commissioned by Charlotte's charitable foundation for a children's literacy program. The event coordinator had insisted he stay long enough to receive public recognition, but recognition had never interested him. Lily tugged gently on his sleeve and whispered that she was hungry. Ethan smiled, promising they would leave as soon as they thanked the organizers. It was a simple promise from a father who had spent years keeping every promise he ever made to his daughter. On stage, Richard extended one arm toward the 3 carefully selected heirs standing in tailored tuxedos. "Charlotte," he announced proudly, "tonight you are free to choose your husband." The ballroom erupted into approving applause. Cameras lifted. Investors exchanged satisfied smiles. Preston Hale straightened his jacket, already convinced the evening belonged to him. Charlotte took one slow breath. Then, instead of walking toward the men waiting beneath the spotlight, she stepped down from the stage. The applause faded into puzzled silence as she crossed the ballroom without hesitation. Every expensive shoe turned in the same direction. Every camera followed her. Ethan looked up only when polished heels stopped a few feet away. Lily instinctively reached for her father's hand. Charlotte met Ethan's calm eyes and spoke with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "Then I choose him." The words seemed to steal the air from the room. Someone near the orchestra dropped a champagne glass onto the carpet. Richard's confident smile disappeared so completely that several board members instinctively looked away. Preston blinked once, certain he had misunderstood. Ethan remained perfectly still. There was no pride in his face, no excitement, no trace of ambition. Only quiet confusion mixed with cautious concern. He glanced at Lily before looking back at Charlotte. His voice remained low enough that only those nearest could hear, yet somehow every person in the ballroom caught every word. "You don't get to choose a man just because everyone else in this room already belongs to your father." Charlotte felt her heartbeat quicken, but she never looked away. After 3 long years, she had finally found the courage to say aloud the decision she had made long before anyone in that ballroom knew his name. She leaned forward just enough for Ethan alone to hear her next sentence. "I didn't choose you tonight," she whispered. "I chose you 3 years ago." 3 years earlier, the Whitmore name filled headlines for all the right reasons, at least according to the public. Charity galas, business awards, and record-breaking acquisitions painted a picture of perfection that seemed untouchable from the outside. What no newspaper printed was how lonely success could become when every conversation sounded like a negotiation. Charlotte Whitmore had spent most of her adult life smiling for cameras, while wondering whether anyone in the room actually saw her as a person instead of an extension of her father's fortune. The answer arrived on a cold November evening after one of the worst days of her life. She had quietly ended an engagement that had looked perfect in photographs, but had never felt honest. Within hours, rumors began spreading through social circles, and photographers gathered outside the downtown hotel where she had escaped, hoping for a few hours of silence before returning home. Instead of finding privacy, she found more cameras waiting at the front entrance. Every flash reminded her that someone was already selling the story of her heartbreak. She stood frozen just inside the revolving door, realizing that the only way out led directly into another public spectacle. That was when a calm voice spoke beside her. "There is another exit if you would rather leave without giving anyone a headline tonight." She turned and saw a tall maintenance supervisor wearing a simple gray work shirt with a stitched name tag that read Ethan Brooks. There was nothing extraordinary about his uniform, yet everything about the way he spoke felt different. He did not ask for a photograph. He did not mention her family. He did not even pretend to recognize her. He simply waited for her answer. Charlotte nodded without speaking. Ethan led her through a quiet service hallway where the polished marble disappeared beneath practical concrete floors and humming utility equipment. Employees greeted him by name as they passed, and each one received the same respectful smile in return. When they reached a side entrance hidden from the street, Ethan noticed she had forgotten her coat in the lobby. Without hesitation, he removed his own jacket and handed it to her. Charlotte started to refuse. Ethan only shrugged gently. A coat can be replaced. Peace of mind is harder to find. She accepted it, surprised by the simple kindness. A car service arrived a few minutes later after Ethan called one from his own phone. Before stepping inside, Charlotte reached into her purse and offered him several $100s. Ethan looked at the folded bills, then back at her with an expression that carried neither offense nor temptation. "Keep it," he said quietly. "If you really want to thank somebody, give someone else a reason to believe people can still be decent." She stared at him for a moment, unsure how to respond. "At least tell me your full name," she asked. Ethan smiled faintly. "Tonight, you do not need to remember my name. You just need to get home safely." The sedan disappeared into the rainy Boston traffic before Charlotte realized she still had his jacket resting across her shoulders. The next morning, she contacted the hotel hoping to return it personally. The manager informed her that Ethan had resigned only hours earlier. His wife, Naomi, had become critically ill, and he intended to spend whatever time remained caring for her and their young daughter. Charlotte asked for an address. Company policy prevented anyone from sharing personal information. Weeks turned into months. She quietly tried to locate him through charities, contractors, and community organizations, but every lead ended the same way. Ethan Brooks had simply vanished from the world she knew. While Charlotte searched, Ethan's life revolved around hospital visits, late-night storybooks, and a little girl who kept asking when mommy would come home. Naomi passed away during the first days of spring, leaving behind unfinished architectural sketches, handwritten notes for Lily, and a husband who suddenly had to become both parents at once. Ethan sold nearly everything that reminded him of easier years. Except one wooden drafting table Naomi had loved. He opened a small woodworking shop on the edge of the city, restoring furniture during the day while Lily colored quietly beside him after school. Business never made him wealthy, but it paid the rent, bought groceries, and allowed him to walk his daughter to school every morning before opening the shop. Customers returned because Ethan repaired more than broken furniture. He listened to widows telling stories about old dining tables. He rebuilt rocking chairs grandparents refused to throw away. He charged less than he probably should have, and occasionally refused payment entirely if he knew a family had fallen on hard times. People trusted his hands because they could feel the care behind every piece of work. One afternoon, nearly 3 years after the night at the hotel, an email arrived from the Whitmore Foundation asking whether Brooks Woodworks would consider creating custom reading displays for a children's literacy program. Ethan accepted because the project would help keep his employees working through the winter. He never noticed the signature at the bottom of the message. Charlotte recognized his name the instant it crossed her desk. She said nothing to her father, nothing to her staff, and nothing to the board. She simply approved the contract herself, knowing that after 3 years, fate had quietly opened a door she thought had been closed forever. When the gala finally dissolved into whispers and unanswered questions, Ethan drove home in complete silence. The old pickup truck rolled through quiet suburban streets while Lily watched raindrops race across the passenger window. She waited almost 10 minutes before speaking because she had learned that her father always found the right words if given enough time. "Daddy," she asked softly, "was that lady joking?" Ethan kept both hands on the steering wheel. "I do not think she was." Lily frowned. "Then why would someone like her choose someone like us?" Ethan smiled, but there was sadness behind it. Sometimes people make decisions because they are scared. Sometimes because they are brave. Tonight, I honestly cannot tell the difference. Lily accepted the answer even though it did not answer the question she truly wanted to ask. Their little white house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees that had already begun losing their leaves. It was nothing like the enormous Whitmore estate, but every fence, every flower bed, and every piece of handmade furniture carried memories that money could never buy. Ethan unlocked the front door, hung his jacket beside Naomi's old gardening hat, and helped Lily finish her homework before making grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Their evening followed the same rhythm it always had. After dinner, Lily practiced reading aloud while Ethan sanded the corner of a handcrafted bookshelf in the garage workshop attached to the house. Nothing about their routine felt extraordinary, yet it was exactly the life Ethan had fought to preserve after losing Naomi. The following morning, Brooks Woodworks opened at 8 o'clock sharp. The smell of cedar and fresh sawdust filled the shop as sunlight slipped through tall windows. Ethan believed people deserved the same respect whether they were buying a custom dining table or repairing a $30 rocking chair. Around 10 o'clock, a black luxury SUV quietly pulled into the parking lot. The driver stepped out first, expecting to open the rear door, but Charlotte was already walking toward the workshop before he reached her. She wore simple blue jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable shoes instead of designer heels. She looked less like the woman from the ballroom and more like someone searching for an honest conversation. Ethan noticed her through the front window, but continued adjusting the cabinet door he was repairing for an elderly customer. He finished tightening the final hinge before wiping his hands on a clean cloth and thanking the customer for trusting his shop again. Only after she left did he walk toward Charlotte. "You found the place," he said calmly. Charlotte glanced around the workshop. Family photographs covered one wall beside children's drawings and handwritten thank you notes from customers. Nothing inside the building had been arranged to impress visitors. Everything simply belonged there. "I was hoping we could talk," she said. Ethan nodded toward a small wooden bench outside beneath a large oak tree. "After I finish helping the next customer." Charlotte waited without complaint. Nearly 40 minutes passed before Ethan finally joined her carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the diner across the street. He handed her one. "They still make it better than I ever could." Charlotte smiled for the first time since the gala. "You are not even going to ask why I came." Ethan looked across the street where Lily was helping an elderly neighbor carry grocery bags from her car. "I think I already know." Charlotte lowered her eyes. "Then you know I meant every word." Ethan remained quiet for several seconds before answering. "No, I know you believed every word when you said it. That is not the same thing." Charlotte looked confused. Ethan continued gently. "You stood in front of a room full of powerful people and chose the one man who was never supposed to be standing there. That took courage. But courage lasts longer than one moment. The question is whether it survives tomorrow morning." Charlotte wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup. "My father will never accept anyone outside the life he planned for me." Ethan nodded. "That sounds like a conversation you need to have with him." She looked directly at him. "I want you to stand beside me." Ethan shook his head almost immediately. "No." The answer surprised her more than if he had raised his voice. "You are not even willing to hear me out?" she asked quietly. Ethan smiled with kindness rather than frustration. "I am willing to listen. I am simply not willing to become another decision someone else makes for me." Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, but Ethan raised one finger politely. 3 years ago, I helped a stranger because it was the right thing to do. Yesterday, you honored me in front of people who expected you to follow a script. I respect that. But respect is not the same as trust." Lily skipped toward them carrying an empty grocery bag and waved happily before stopping beside Charlotte. She studied the billionaire's daughter with honest curiosity. "Are you still choosing people?" she asked. Innocently. Charlotte blinked. "What do you mean?" Lily shrugged. Sometimes grown-ups choose things because they look nice. Daddy says people are different because they have to choose every day. Ethan smiled quietly. Children often reach truths adults spent years trying to explain. Charlotte looked from Lily to Ethan and realized that neither of them could be persuaded by wealth, emotion, or dramatic speeches. If she truly wanted Ethan to stand beside her, she would first have to prove that she was willing to stand where he had been all along. Charlotte arrived the following Monday at exactly 7:30 in the morning wearing work boots that had obviously never touched a construction site before. The luxury sport utility vehicle that usually followed her stopped at the end of the street after Ethan politely asked the driver not to park in front of the workshop. She walked the remaining 50 yards carrying her own lunch in a paper bag while the driver looked completely confused. Ethan was already unloading lumber from an old delivery truck with two employees who greeted Charlotte with polite smiles but no special attention. Nobody cared that newspapers called her one of the most influential women in Massachusetts. Inside Brooks Woodworks, everyone earned respect the same way. Ethan handed her a pair of safety glasses and a canvas apron. "Today we are repairing kitchen cabinets for a single mother with 3 children," he said. "You can either help us work or spend the day watching. Both are choices. Only one is useful." Charlotte nodded and slipped on the apron without arguing. The first hour humbled her more than any board meeting ever had. She struggled to carry heavy boards without losing her balance, measured twice and still marked the wrong cut, and accidentally scattered a box of wood screws across the floor. She immediately apologized, expecting someone to tell her not to worry because she was the boss's daughter. Instead, one of Ethan's older employees simply knelt beside her, smiled kindly, and said, "Everybody drops the screws on the first day." Charlotte laughed at herself for the first time in weeks. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. By noon, they arrived at a modest ranch house where a young widow named Melissa welcomed them inside. Her youngest son proudly showed Ethan a chair that had been wobbling for months. Ethan crouched beside the boy, tested the chair, and promised it would be steady before lunch. Charlotte quietly reached for her checkbook when she noticed peeling paint, aging appliances, and worn carpeting. Ethan gently placed his hand over the checkbook before she could write a single number. "Ask what she needs before deciding what she should have," he whispered. Charlotte hesitated before turning toward Melissa. "What would make the biggest difference for your family right now?" Melissa smiled with tired eyes. "Honestly, if somebody could fix the kitchen cabinets so I can stop worrying that one of the doors will fall on my little girl." Charlotte slowly closed the checkbook. She spent the next 3 hours sanding cabinet doors beside Ethan while Melissa's children colored pictures at the dining table. Nobody discussed business mergers or investment portfolios. They talked about school lunches, little league games, and the best recipe for homemade chili. Charlotte realized she had spent years funding community programs without truly sitting inside the communities they served. On the drive back, she remained unusually quiet. Lily was waiting outside the workshop after school with a backpack almost as big as she was. She noticed the dust covering Charlotte's jeans and tilted her head with obvious surprise. "You got dirty," Lily said. Charlotte looked down at her boots and laughed softly. "I guess I did." Lily stepped closer, studying a tiny streak of blue paint on Charlotte's sleeve. "Did anybody make fun of you?" Charlotte smiled. "Only me. I made enough mistakes for everyone." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "Daddy says people who are afraid of mistakes never learn anything worth remembering." Ethan unlocked the workshop and invited everyone inside for lemonade before closing for the evening. As Charlotte helped sweep the floor without being asked, her eyes wandered toward a wooden drafting table standing in the corner beneath a bright window. Rolled sketches rested neatly across its surface, beside an old metal ruler and several sharpened pencils. One drawing had partially slipped open, revealing the detailed design of a children's reading room shaped around large circular windows. Charlotte froze. She recognized the artistic style immediately. Years earlier, she had approved funding for a community literacy project that mysteriously disappeared before construction ever began. The curved window design had been unlike anything she had ever seen. Slowly, she stepped closer and noticed a handwritten signature in the lower corner. Naomi Brooks. She did not touch the drawing. Instead, she looked toward Ethan, who was helping Lily organize paintbrushes on the opposite side of the workshop. His expression softened the moment he noticed where she was standing. "Those were my wife's designs," he said quietly. She believed children should never be afraid to walk into a room filled with books. Charlotte felt an unexpected ache in her chest because she suddenly remembered seeing that exact signature buried inside an old foundation proposal years ago. The project had vanished without explanation, and she had never questioned why. For the first time since walking into Brooks Woodworks, she sensed that the story connecting Ethan, Naomi, and her own family had begun long before any ballroom, any public announcement, or any impossible choice. By the end of the third week, nobody at Brooks Woodworks treated Charlotte like a billionaire's daughter anymore. She was simply the woman who arrived early, swept the floors before anyone asked, and stayed late until the last cabinet door lined up perfectly with its frame. Her hands had developed small blisters that she tried unsuccessfully to hide, and the expensive manicure she once worried about had disappeared beneath fine lines of sawdust. Ethan noticed every change without mentioning any of them. He believed genuine character revealed itself through consistency, not compliments. Late Friday afternoon, as they finished loading supplies into the truck, Charlotte walked beside Ethan in comfortable silence until he finally spoke. "Tomorrow night, my answer changes." She looked at him hopefully. "Does that mean you trust me?" Ethan smiled gently. "It means you have earned the chance to keep earning it." Before she could ask another question, his phone buzzed. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number, but he answered anyway. Richard Whitmore's calm voice carried through the speaker with practiced confidence. "Mr. Brooks, I believe it is time we met properly. Dinner tomorrow evening. 7 o'clock. My home." Ethan looked toward Charlotte. She had already guessed who was calling. "I assume this is not a request," Ethan replied evenly. Richard paused for a moment before answering. "It is an opportunity." Ethan thanked him politely and ended the call without promising anything. Charlotte exhaled slowly. He has never invited anyone into that dining room unless he intended to evaluate them. Ethan picked up another toolbox. "Then I suppose I should make sure I am evaluated honestly." The following evening, the Whitmore estate looked exactly as Lily imagined castles would look if they had been built in New England. Long stone walls surrounded carefully trimmed gardens, fountains reflected the fading sunset, and uniformed attendants greeted arriving guests with rehearsed smiles. Lily squeezed Ethan's hand as they walked toward the entrance. "Daddy," she whispered, "do people really live here?" Ethan looked down at her. "They do. But remember something. A big house tells you how much space someone owns. It does not tell you how much peace lives inside it." Lily nodded as though storing the sentence somewhere she would remember for years. Charlotte met them at the front door instead of waiting inside. She had chosen a simple emerald dress with almost no jewelry, and for the first time in many years she felt more nervous than she ever had before speaking at a shareholders meeting. She bent slightly to greet Lily first. "I am really glad you came." Lily smiled politely. "I wanted to see if rich people eat macaroni and cheese." Charlotte laughed so sincerely that even Ethan could not hide a smile. Sometimes they should. The warmth lasted only until the dining room doors opened. Richard Whitmore stood near the fireplace beside Margaret Whitmore and Preston Hale. Every place setting had been arranged with perfect precision. Crystal glasses reflected soft candlelight, and several members of the family advisory board had unexpectedly joined the dinner. Ethan immediately understood that this was never meant to be a family meal. It was an examination. Richard welcomed everyone with polished courtesy before inviting them to sit. Conversation began pleasantly enough. Margaret asked Lily about school. Lily proudly described the birdhouse she had built with her father. Even Richard smiled briefly at her excitement. But as dinner continued, the questions slowly shifted toward Ethan. Preston leaned back comfortably and asked, "How many employees does your business have?" "4," Ethan answered. "And they support 4 families." Preston nodded with an almost invisible smile. "Annual revenue?" Ethan calmly took another sip of water. "Enough to pay honest wages and keep the lights on." Richard folded his hands together. "Surely you understand the responsibilities attached to Charlotte's life. Investors, media attention, international travel. It is considerably different from running a neighborhood workshop." Ethan met the older man's eyes without hesitation. "Every life carries responsibility, Mr. Whitmore. Mine just happens to begin before sunrise with packing school lunches." A quiet silence settled over the table. Preston tried another approach. "You must admit that marrying into this family would solve many financial problems." Ethan answered without irritation. "Money can solve unpaid bills." It cannot solve loneliness, grief, broken trust, or a frightened child who wakes up missing her mother. Lily lowered her eyes toward her plate. Charlotte gently placed her hand over the little girl's for just a second before letting go. Preston noticed the gesture and frowned. "Forgive my honesty," he continued, "but raising another man's child would already be difficult for most people. Asking Charlotte to build her future around someone else's family seems unfair." Before Charlotte could respond, Ethan quietly placed his fork on the table. His voice remained steady, but every person in the room listened. "My daughter is not someone else's burden. She is the greatest privilege of my life. Anyone who cannot tell the difference does not understand what family means." The room fell completely still. Richard looked at Ethan differently than he had only minutes earlier. Charlotte felt tears gathering but refused to let them fall. Then, without saying a word, Lily slowly reached beneath the table and slipped her small hand into Charlotte's. This time, Charlotte did not hesitate to hold it. The drive home from the Whitmore estate was quieter than usual, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Lily eventually fell asleep against the passenger window with one hand still holding the small cloth rabbit her mother had sewn years earlier. Ethan carried her inside without waking her, tucked the blanket around her shoulders, and stood beside her bed for a long moment before quietly closing the bedroom door. He knew the dinner had changed something, although he could not yet decide whether that change would heal old wounds or open new ones. Across town, Charlotte sat alone in the family library long after every guest had gone home. The house was silent except for the ticking of an antique grandfather clock that had measured decades of Whitmore history. Yet her thoughts refused to stay in the present. She could still hear Ethan's calm voice defending Lily with a dignity that required no anger. Nobody had ever spoken inside that dining room with such quiet certainty. Most people entered the Whitmore estate hoping to impress her father. Ethan had only wanted to protect his daughter. That difference stayed with her all night. The following morning, Charlotte returned to Brooks Woodworks carrying a small box of pastries from a neighborhood bakery. She placed them on the workbench without making an announcement. Ethan's employees accepted them with grateful smiles before returning to work as if nothing unusual had happened. Charlotte appreciated that nobody treated generosity as a performance. While organizing lumber near the drafting table, she found herself looking once again at Naomi's carefully rolled architectural drawings. This time Ethan noticed before she spoke. He carefully unrolled one blueprint across the table. Sunlight poured through the workshop window, revealing detailed sketches of reading corners, wide windows, wheelchair ramps, and circular shelves designed so children could reach every book without asking for help. Charlotte slowly traced one corner of the page with her eyes. "I remember this design," she whispered. "The Whitmore Foundation reviewed something almost identical years ago." Ethan nodded gently. Naomi believed every child deserved a place where learning felt safe instead of intimidating. She spent nearly 2 years designing community libraries for neighborhoods that could not afford them. Charlotte looked closer and suddenly recognized a familiar project code printed in the corner. She had seen that exact number while reviewing archived foundation records several months earlier. The proposal had been marked canceled without explanation. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Ethan leaned against the workbench and took a slow breath. Naomi discovered that the construction company assigned to the project wanted to replace several safety materials with cheaper alternatives. She refused to approve the changes. She believed children should never pay the price for someone else's profit. Charlotte felt a chill despite the warm workshop. Who made the final decision? Ethan looked toward Lily, who was sitting nearby coloring wooden bookmarks for an upcoming school fundraiser. He lowered his voice. "The paperwork came through one of your family's development companies." Naomi appealed the decision several times. Every request disappeared. Eventually, the entire project was canceled. Charlotte stared at the blueprint in disbelief. "Why did nobody tell me?" Ethan offered a sad smile. "You were not running the foundation then. You were still learning how your father's world worked. Naomi never blamed you." Charlotte swallowed hard. "What happened after the project was canceled?" Ethan folded the blueprint carefully before answering. "She lost several important contracts because she refused to compromise. Some people quietly decided she was difficult to work with. She never regretted protecting children, but watching her career slowly disappear hurt more than she ever admitted." Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment. Suddenly, countless forgotten meetings, missing reports, and unexplained budget revisions from years ago formed pieces of a picture she had never been allowed to see. Before she could speak again, Daniel Reed, the longtime Whitmore family attorney, walked into the workshop carrying an old leather document case. He greeted Ethan respectfully before turning toward Charlotte. "I have been trying to reach you since last night," he said. "There are archived files your father never requested, but I believe you need to see them." Daniel carefully removed several faded folders from the case. Inside were engineering reports, inspection letters, and handwritten notes bearing Naomi's signature. One page contained a recommendation rejecting lower-quality building materials. Another included correspondence showing repeated requests for independent safety reviews that had never received a response. Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she turned each page. Near the bottom of the final folder, she noticed the name of the subcontractor responsible for the disputed changes. "Hale Development Partners." She looked up immediately. "Hale?" Daniel nodded gravely. The company belonged to Preston Hale's father at the time. Preston now controls the business. Silence settled across the workshop. Ethan did not celebrate the discovery. He simply looked at Naomi's signature resting quietly on the table. Charlotte finally understood that the conflict surrounding her family had never started with a ballroom or a public choice. Long before she asked Ethan to stand beside her, someone else's ambition had already taken something precious from the woman he loved, and the truth had been waiting patiently inside forgotten files for years. The discovery inside the faded folders should have brought relief, but instead it filled the workshop with a silence that felt heavier than any accusation. Charlotte carefully returned Naomi's documents to the leather case, while Daniel Reed looked toward Ethan with quiet sympathy. "These records were never destroyed," Daniel said. "They were simply buried inside archived files that nobody was expected to read." Again, Ethan rested one hand on the old drafting table without taking his eyes off Naomi's signature. "She always believed the truth had a way of surviving," he said softly. "She just never lived long enough to see it." Charlotte wanted to apologize, but every sentence sounded too small compared to the years Ethan and Lily had already lived through. Before anyone could continue, Charlotte's phone began vibrating repeatedly. Richard Whitmore's name filled the screen. She answered immediately. Her father's voice sounded weaker than she had ever heard it. "Come home. Right now." 30 minutes later, Charlotte walked into the Whitmore estate and immediately sensed something was wrong. The usual calm efficiency had disappeared. Attorneys moved quickly through the hallways carrying folders, assistants whispered into phones, and Margaret Whitmore stood near the staircase with worried eyes. Richard was sitting in his study, looking older than he had only 2 days before. A folder lay open across his desk. Preston Hale stood beside the fireplace wearing the same composed expression he always carried. Richard motioned for Charlotte to close the door. "Daniel has been asking questions about old development projects," he began. "Tell me you have nothing to do with this." Charlotte remained calm. "I asked him to help me understand what happened to Naomi Brooks' community library project." Preston sighed dramatically before speaking. "Charlotte, you are allowing old paperwork to distract you from responsibilities that affect thousands of employees today." She turned toward him. "Children almost lost safe buildings because someone wanted larger profits. That is not a distraction." Preston folded his hands. "You are speaking about decisions made years ago by people who are no longer here to defend themselves." Charlotte answered without raising her voice. "The documents still exist." Richard slowly stood from his chair. "Enough. If those files become public, every newspaper in the country will reopen stories that should remain buried. Investors will panic. Stock prices will fall. Thousands of families depend on this company." Charlotte looked at her father with sadness rather than anger. Then perhaps the company should have protected those families before protecting its reputation. Richard closed his eyes briefly, as if struggling beneath a weight that had been growing for years. Preston stepped forward smoothly. "There is another solution. End this relationship with Ethan Brooks. Publicly clarify that your announcement at the gala was an emotional mistake. Once the media moves on, we can review the old files privately without destroying everything your father spent his life building." Charlotte immediately understood what he was asking. He was not offering a compromise. He was offering silence. Before she could answer, Richard suddenly reached for the edge of his desk. Margaret hurried forward as his face lost its color. The family physician, who happened to be meeting with Richard that afternoon, quickly entered the room after hearing the commotion. Within minutes, Richard was resting in a nearby sitting room while the doctor assured everyone that he had experienced a stress-related episode and needed complete rest, not panic. Charlotte sat beside her father's chair as the doctor quietly left. Richard reached for her hand with surprising vulnerability. "Please," he whispered, "do not tear this family apart. I know mistakes were made. I know I should have asked more questions years ago. But if everything collapses now, people who had nothing to do with those decisions will suffer too." Tears filled Charlotte's eyes. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire who controlled boardrooms, but an aging father terrified of watching his life's work crumble. Across the room, Preston remained perfectly silent, allowing Richard's fear to speak on his behalf. Charlotte spent the entire night wrestling with an impossible choice. The following afternoon, reporters gathered outside Whitmore Holdings after rumors of internal disagreements began spreading through financial circles. Cameras pointed toward the entrance as Charlotte stepped behind the microphones alone. Ethan and Lily watched the live broadcast from the small television mounted above the workbench inside Brooks Woodworks. Every employee quietly stopped working. Charlotte took one slow breath before speaking. "Recent speculation regarding my personal life has become an unnecessary distraction. Mr. Ethan Brooks and I will not be moving forward together." She paused just long enough for headlines to begin writing themselves. "I ask that everyone respect his privacy and allow him to continue raising his daughter away from public attention." She never criticized Ethan. She never lied about his character. But she also never defended him or mentioned Naomi's files. The cameras captured only the ending, not the reason behind it. Inside the workshop, Lily stared at the television without blinking. After several silent seconds, she slipped the small woven friendship bracelet Charlotte had helped her make only days earlier from her wrist and placed it gently on the workbench. "She chose them," Lily whispered. Ethan looked at the bracelet, then at the screen where Charlotte stood alone beneath a storm of flashing cameras. He turned the television off without saying a single unkind word. Finally, he knelt beside his daughter and spoke so softly that everyone in the workshop leaned closer to hear. "Sometimes people truly care about you," he said. "But fear can become louder than love if they do not face it. We cannot choose another person's courage. We can only choose our own." Lily nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the bracelet lying quietly between them, and for the first time since Charlotte had entered their lives, the little girl wondered whether promises made by grown-ups could disappear as easily as words spoken before a crowd. The morning after the broadcast, Brooks Woodworks returned to its familiar rhythm as though nothing had happened. The table saw hummed, the scent of fresh pine drifted through the workshop, and customers continued bringing in worn rocking chairs, scratched dining tables, and family heirlooms that deserved another chance. Ethan never mentioned Charlotte's statement. If anyone asked, he simply smiled politely and changed the subject. He refused to let disappointment become another inheritance passed down to Lily. Yet every afternoon, Lily glanced toward the front window for a few quiet seconds before returning to her homework. She never admitted whom she expected to see. Across the city, Charlotte discovered that silence had not protected anyone. Daniel Reed arrived at her office carrying another stack of files that had been hidden inside a warehouse archive scheduled for disposal. Several newly uncovered inspection reports proved something the earlier documents only suggested. The unsafe material substitutions had never been approved by Whitmore Holdings directly. They had been requested through Hale Development Partners before being disguised as cost-saving recommendations. More disturbing still, internal correspondence revealed that Preston's father had intentionally exaggerated the financial risks of Naomi's proposal, convincing several executives that canceling the project would protect shareholders. Richard had signed the final authorization believing the reports were accurate. He had made a terrible decision, but he had not created the deception. Charlotte slowly lowered the final page. "My father was manipulated." Daniel nodded. "He failed to ask enough questions, and that failure carried consequences. But Preston's family built the lie that shaped those decisions." Charlotte leaned back in her chair, feeling equal parts relief and heartbreak. Everything she had sacrificed to protect was built upon a false choice. That afternoon, she requested an emergency meeting with Richard. He listened quietly as Daniel presented every document in chronological order. When the last page settled on the desk, The older man's shoulders seemed to sink beneath years of regret. I trusted people who valued profit over responsibility, he whispered. And because I stopped asking difficult questions, Naomi Brooks paid the price. Margaret reached for his hand without saying a word. Richard looked toward Charlotte with tired eyes. I asked you to protect this family. Instead, you protected my pride. They are not the same thing. Before anyone could respond, an assistant hurried into the room carrying a sealed envelope marked confidential. Inside was a copy of the engagement announcement Preston intended to release the following evening during the company's annual investor celebration. Attached to it was a private memorandum outlining a restructuring plan that would quietly transfer several Whitmore community assets into Hale-controlled partnerships after the marriage. Richard read every page twice before placing the documents on his desk. He never wanted this family, he said softly. He wanted control of everything attached to it. Charlotte closed her eyes for only a moment before making her decision. Then tomorrow night the truth belongs to everyone. News spread quickly that the annual investor celebration would proceed as scheduled. Financial reporters assumed the event would officially announce Charlotte's engagement to Preston and reassure nervous markets after days of speculation. Hundreds of guests filled the ballroom while television cameras prepared for a live broadcast. Back at Brooks Woodworks, Ethan had no intention of attending. He was loading handcrafted bookshelves into his truck for delivery to a neighborhood elementary school when Daniel Reed arrived unexpectedly. Richard asked me to bring these, Daniel said, handing Ethan Naomi's original blueprints along with every authenticated inspection report. Ethan carefully accepted the folder without opening it. Why bring them to me? Daniel answered honestly. Because Naomi trusted you to protect what mattered most. Tonight should not belong to lawyers or billionaires. It should belong to the truth, she defended. Ethan looked toward the school library waiting for its new shelves. Children are expecting me. Daniel smiled gently. Then deliver them. Afterwards, come only if you believe Naomi would have wanted you there. Ethan drove to the school first. He spent nearly an hour helping volunteers install every bookshelf exactly where Naomi's drawings suggested children would feel most welcome. Lily carefully placed the very first book onto the lowest shelf so younger readers could reach it without asking for help. When they finished, Ethan quietly touched the edge of one wooden shelf and remembered Naomi, saying that every child deserved a place where learning felt safe. Only then did he close the folder Daniel had given him and drive toward the investor celebration. Meanwhile, inside the crowded ballroom, Preston stood confidently beside the stage, convinced the evening would secure everything his family had pursued for years. Charlotte waited behind the curtain, holding the original blueprints against her chest instead of the prepared engagement speech. As the master of ceremonies announced her name, she took one steady breath, stepped into the lights, and looked across the room. Near the entrance, Ethan had just arrived with Lily standing quietly beside him, not to reclaim a promise, not to demand an apology, but simply to stand where the truth finally had a chance to be heard. Charlotte stood beneath the lights without unfolding the speech prepared by the public relations team. The ballroom waited for the polished announcement everyone expected, but instead she placed Naomi's original blueprints on the podium where every camera could see them. Tonight, she began calmly, I was supposed to introduce the future of this company. Instead, I need to acknowledge a part of its past. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Preston's confident smile faded almost instantly. Richard remained seated in the front row, watching his daughter with tired but steady eyes. Charlotte lifted one of the drawings. Years ago, an architect named Naomi Brooks designed community libraries where every child, regardless of income, could feel welcome. She refused to approve unsafe construction materials. Her project disappeared, and so did the truth. She invited Daniel Reed to join her on stage. Together, they displayed authenticated inspection reports, engineering reviews, and internal correspondence that established how Hale Development Partners had manipulated the approval process through false financial reports. Daniel explained each document carefully, never exaggerating a single fact. Reporters stopped whispering and started taking notes. Investors who had expected a celebration now watched evidence unfold one page at a time. Preston stepped forward with practiced confidence. These papers are being misrepresented, he declared. Old projects are complicated. Memories fade. Before anyone could respond, Richard slowly rose from his seat. The room fell. Silent. The documents are authentic, he said. Years ago I signed a decision without asking the questions I should have asked. That failure belongs to me. But deception belongs to those who created it. He turned toward the board members seated along the front row. Effective immediately, I am requesting an independent investigation into every contract connected to Hale Development Partners. Until that review is complete, all pending agreements are suspended. Preston looked around the ballroom, expecting allies to defend him, but none spoke. Several board members quietly nodded in agreement with Richard. Others requested copies of the documents before the meeting ended. No one applauded. The moment was too serious for celebration. Charlotte then looked toward the entrance where Ethan and Lily had remained quietly standing together. There is one more truth I need to tell, she said. Several days ago I stood before cameras and ended my relationship with Ethan Brooks. I believe protecting my father meant remaining silent. I was wrong. Silence did not protect my family. It only delayed justice for another family that had already carried enough pain. She stepped down from the stage and walked across the ballroom until she stood in front of Ethan. I cannot undo what my silence cost you or Lily, she said softly. I am not asking you to forget it. I only wanted the truth to reach you before it reached tomorrow's headlines. Ethan looked at the blueprints in her hands before answering. The truth was never the difficult part. Living with it was. Charlotte lowered her eyes. I understand. Ethan gently accepted Naomi's drawings. She would have wanted children to have those libraries more than she would have wanted revenge. Richard slowly approached them. The billionaire who had once measured people by influence now stood before Ethan without assistants, lawyers, or security surrounding him. Mr. Brooks, he said quietly, I cannot give your wife back the opportunities she lost, and I cannot erase the years your family carried this burden alone. But I can admit that my pride blinded me. I am sorry. Ethan studied the older man's face for several seconds before replying. An apology cannot rewrite history, but it can change what the next chapter looks like. Richard nodded with grateful humility. During the weeks that followed, Whitmore Holdings publicly funded the construction of community libraries based on Naomi's original designs, ensuring every building met the safety standards she had fought to protect. The company established an independent ethics review board, and Richard voluntarily stepped down as chairman after helping oversee the transition. The investigation confirmed the fraudulent practices inside Hale Development Partners, ending their business relationship with Whitmore Holdings through lawful corporate action. Brooks Woodworks received offers from wealthy investors, but Ethan accepted only the projects that aligned with Naomi's vision. He refused to turn the workshop into a luxury brand because he believed its greatest value had always been serving ordinary families. Months passed before Charlotte visited the workshop again. This time there were no reporters, no security vehicles, and no public announcements. She arrived early on a Saturday morning carrying work gloves instead of flowers. Ethan handed her a paintbrush without a speech, and together they spent the morning finishing bookshelves for another neighborhood school. Lily watched quietly from across the room before walking over with something hidden behind her back. It was the woven friendship bracelet she had taken off after the painful press conference. She held it out to Charlotte with a shy smile. I think you forgot this, she said. Charlotte knelt to Lily's height. I was hoping I could earn it back someday. Lily carefully tied the bracelet around Charlotte's wrist by herself. Daddy says people choose every day, she replied. You kept choosing us even when nobody was watching. Ethan looked toward the sunlight pouring through the workshop windows and finally smiled with complete peace. Later that afternoon, the three of them helped install the final bookshelf inside the first Naomi Brooks Community Library. Above the entrance, carved into handcrafted oak, were simple words chosen by Ethan from one of Naomi's old notebooks. Every child deserves a place where they feel they belong. Families slowly filled the room. Children reached for books placed on shelves built at their height. Richard quietly entered alone, picked up a picture book, and began reading to a group of children gathered on a colorful rug without introducing himself. Charlotte looked at Ethan. 3 years ago, you helped a stranger leave through a side door so the world would stop watching her. Ethan smiled warmly. Sometimes people need privacy before they can find courage. Charlotte slipped her hand into his. This time he did not pull away because nothing stood between them except honesty. Lily happily walked ahead carrying her cloth rabbit in one hand and her favorite library book in the other. As the afternoon sun filled the reading room, Ethan realized that the greatest inheritance anyone could leave behind was never wealth or power. It was the quiet decision to make another person feel seen, respected, and welcome. And in that peaceful room built from truth instead of pride, every promise that truly mattered had finally been kept.